If the day is coming to an end, let this hour be a quiet place to rest. We make these slow histories to help you sleep, to help you unwind, and to give your mind something gentle to follow. Thank you for joining us and for listening to Before the Screen. Tonight we begin with a familiar object and the world it slowly changed. The telephone. This is the telephone and the evening at home. Before the first ring, there was a different kind of evening. There was a time when an evening at home could close around you more completely than it does now. The day had its own ways of arriving. Someone might knock at the door. A letter might come in the morning and be read at the kitchen table after supper. A neighbour might call if the road was dry and the hour was reasonable. News moved, but it moved with the weather, with trains, with footsteps, with the patience of people who knew that most things could wait until tomorrow. When the lamps were lit, the world outside did not disappear, but it became more distant. There was the small territory of the house, a chair near the fire, a kettle settling after it had boiled, a clock marking a minute, without asking anyone to answer it. If you were needed urgently, there were people who could come and find you. But in ordinary life, to be at home was also to be, for a while, beyond reach. This is a story about the end of that particular kind of distance. Not the whole history of the telephone. Not simply the story of wires, patents, instruments, and companies. Those things matter, and we will meet them. But tonight, we will keep returning to a quieter question. What happened to an ordinary evening when a voice from somewhere else could suddenly enter the room? At first, the answer was, not very much. The earliest telephones were rare. They were expensive, unfamiliar, and often installed where work was done. In offices, shops, railway stations, hotels, police stations, and doctors' rooms, they made a practical kind of sense. A message could cross a town without a messenger crossing it first. But inventions do not remain where they begin. A device made for business can find its way into the hallway of a house. A wire placed for convenience can alter habits. A bell can create a new expectation. And once a household has learned that a distant person may call at any hour that seems acceptable, the old boundary around the evening becomes a little more permeable. The telephone did not make people available all at once. That change came unevenly over decades across different countries, cities, neighborhoods, and incomes. Some homes had a telephone long before others. Some shared a line. Some depended on an operator. Some waited for the network to reach their street. The details were never identical. Still, a broad change can be felt. The home became a place where the outside world could ring. To understand that change, it helps to begin before the telephone seemed inevitable. Before the number, the directory, the phrase, "I'll call you." Before a person could be absent from the room, and yet, in a limited and surprising way, present there. Let us begin with the evening itself. Imagine not a particular family, but an ordinary household in the late 19th century. The details might differ from one place to another. The rooms may be small or large. The fuel in the grate may be coal or wood. There may be gas light, oil lamps, or candles. Yet the evening has a recognizable shape. Work has stopped, or nearly stopped. Coats and boots are placed aside. A meal has been eaten. There may be mending, reading, a newspaper passed from one pair of hands to another, a child being persuaded towards sleep. There may also be quiet work still to do. Accounts, washing, preparation for tomorrow. Domestic life was never as effortless as a nostalgic picture can make it seem. But communication had a physical character. To send a message, someone wrote it, carried it, posted it, or arranged for it to travel by rail or telegraph. A telegram could move quickly, but it arrived as a small piece of paper, handed over by a messenger. Its speed was remarkable precisely because it was unusual. A letter asked the reader for time. It could be set aside, reread, folded, kept in a drawer. Conversation was attached to presence. You spoke with people who had come into the room, or whom you had gone out to meet. If a relative lived in another town, their life had a different rhythm in your imagination. They might be vividly loved and frequently remembered. Yet you did not expect an update from them while you were putting away the supper things. This was not a better world because of its slowness. Delays could bring worry. Isolation could be real. A doctor might be hard to reach. A business opportunity might pass. A worker could lose a day traveling to deliver information that a later generation would send in a few moments. The point is simpler. Distance used to have more authority. It decided when a conversation could happen. It gave the home a measure of privacy, though not always a chosen one. It made waiting part of daily life. You waited for the post, for a visitor, for a train, for someone to return. You could not easily reduce that waiting by asking, "Where are you now?" The old evening, therefore, had a certain silence built into it. Not perfect silence. Homes were full of sounds. Conversation, chores, wind at the window, traffic in the street, animals, machinery, music from a nearby house. But there was no little mechanical summons that could demand attention from an unseen person beyond the wall. When the telephone entered domestic life, it entered this landscape of habits. It did not merely add a sound, it changed the meaning of quiet. Quiet was no longer only the absence of people. It could become the interval before the bell rang. The device that would make this possible was born from experiments in sound and electricity. Like many well-known inventions, it had more than one lineage, more than one person around it, and more complexity than a single heroic image can carry. But one date gives us a useful doorway. On March 7th, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell received a United States patent for an apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically. A few days later, Bell and his assistant Thomas Watson achieved a famous early intelligible transmission. The words are often repeated because they are so ordinary. A request for someone in another room to come nearer. It is a modest beginning for an immense change. A voice crossed a wire. Not a code, not a written message, but the uneven sound of a human voice. and that voice was about to travel much farther than one room. The first telephone was not, in the modern sense, a friendly object. It did not sit silently on a bedside table waiting to make life easier. It was an apparatus. It had parts that required explanation. It asked people to believe that ordinary speech could be turned into electrical variation, carried along a wire, and made audible again at the other end. For people accustomed to the telegraph, the idea was startling. The telegraph already allowed messages to move quickly over a distance, but it required a system of signals, trained operators, written forms, and translation back into words. The telephone offered something stranger, the apparent immediacy of speech. At the sending end, a voice made a diaphragm move. Electrical changes travelled along a wire. At the receiving end, another diaphragm moved in response, making the air vibrate again. The sound was not magic, though it could easily feel magical. It was a chain of physical events, delicate and imperfect, carrying the pattern of a voice. Early sound was often faint. The person at the other end could be difficult to hear. A caller had to learn where to stand, how loudly to speak, when to listen. The telephone was not yet transparent. You noticed the device between you and the other person. That awkwardness is worth remembering because it kept the novelty visible. To talk into a box, a tube, or a wall-mounted instrument and hear someone answer from elsewhere was not yet a background routine. It was an event. Visitors might be invited to listen. A call could gather a small audience. The technology announced itself. It also had an immediate limitation. A telephone connected two places. But how would one person reach many possible people? How could a caller choose whom to speak to without a separate wire leading to every house, shop, and office? The answer was the exchange. In January 1878, the first commercial telephone exchange began operation in New Haven, Connecticut. It started in a storefront with a small number of subscribers. Its switchboard could connect lines, though only a limited number of conversations could happen at once. This was a new kind of place, a room in which human attention and electrical connections worked together to bring distant people into contact. The exchange did more than make the network larger. It introduced another human voice into the act of calling. You did not simply dial a number. You signaled an operator. You asked for the person, office, or line you wanted. The operator made the connection if it was possible. In the early telephone world, the path to a private conversation could pass through a public workplace. For many callers, this would become ordinary. Yet, it carried its own etiquette. You were expected to be clear. You were expected not to keep others waiting unnecessarily. The operator was a worker, not a mysterious force within the machine. She, because women became especially associated with this work, heard the hurried, polite, irritated, anxious, and affectionate beginnings of countless calls. The telephone is sometimes remembered as a machine that removed intermediaries. At first, it often depended on them. This matters when we picture the telephone arriving at home. The line was not simply a private tunnel between two people. It was part of a system. Poles outside, wires overhead or underground. A local exchange, directories, rules, workers, bills, and other subscribers. The voice in the wire was made possible by a small society of infrastructure. And because that society had limits, the first domestic telephone was not an invitation to talk endlessly. It was a scarce connection, often used with purpose. In a home, a telephone needed a place. This sounds almost too simple. But where an object is placed changes how a household encounters it. A telephone might be fixed to a wall in the hallway, near the front door, or in a room used for work. It might hang in a small enclosed booth or stand on a table in a shared room. It was not initially the portable companion it would later become. It belonged to a particular point in the house. That point became a small threshold. To answer, someone had to leave what they were doing. A person reading by the fire crossed the room. Someone washing up dried their hands. A child might be told not to touch it. A guest might pause in conversation. The bell did not merely make sound, it rearranged bodies in the home. The telephone had a presence even when it was silent. It announced that the house was now part of a wider circuit. A person elsewhere could seek this household. A doctor's office, a shop, a relative, a workplace, or a neighbor could make the instrument ring. The family did not know who it would be until someone answered. That uncertainty gave the ring its force. A knock on the door came from a person who was already nearby. A letter came from someone who had chosen paper and delay. A telephone call was different. It arrived from an invisible distance and asked for an immediate response. Some early households used the telephone chiefly for practical matters. Orders could be placed, appointments could be arranged, a worker could be called home. Information about trains, weather, supplies, or a local emergency could be sought quickly. For a household with a business, the division between domestic and commercial life could become less firm. The shop might close, but the line remained in the building. For other homes, the telephone was a sign of status before it became a necessity. Having one could suggest prosperity, modernity, or a particular kind of connection to town life. The first directories, with their short lists of names and businesses, made this visible. To be listed was to be one of the people who could be reached by this new method. But status does not explain the whole feeling of it. There was also curiosity. A child growing up with a telephone had to learn that a voice could come from an object. Adults had to learn how to begin a conversation without the ordinary cues of a face, a door, a chair offered to a visitor. They had to say who they were. They had to ask if the person was there. They had to take messages. The familiar rituals of the call were slowly invented in countless homes. Hello became more than a greeting. It became a way of opening a line into uncertainty. And the hallway, so often a passage between inside and outside, gained a new function. It became the place where outside could enter without opening the door. There was, however, an important qualification. Not every line was private. The telephone network grew by compromise as well as invention. Building separate lines to every possible subscriber was costly. In many places, several households shared a line. This arrangement was known as a party line. To modern ears, the name may sound cheerful. The experience could be anything but private. Homes on a shared line could have distinct ringing patterns, so that each household learned which signal was meant for them. A particular arrangement of rings might bring one person to the telephone, while another family listened from a different house. The line could be busy when someone else was using it. A caller might wait. A conversation might be overheard, deliberately or accidentally. The party line made the telephone a communal technology. It extended contact, but it also complicated privacy. People developed rules, complaints, jokes, suspicions, and habits around it. One person's long conversation could be another person's inconvenience. An urgent call could be delayed. A neighbor might know more than a neighbor had previously been able to know. We should be careful not to turn this into a single universal story. Party lines varied by place and period. Their terms and customs differed. Some people remembered them with affection, some with frustration, and many with both. But the general tension is easy to understand. The same wire that promised connection could also make the boundaries between households thinner. This was one of the first lessons of domestic telephony. Communication could be intimate without being entirely private. A voice might travel into your home, but the route it used belonged to a larger system. Other people could be close to that route. Operators, neighbors, company employees, and anyone with access to the line. There was also a moral geography to the telephone. How late was too late to call? Was it proper to call during dinner? Was a young person allowed to spend a long time speaking with a friend? Could a caller ask directly for someone, or should they first exchange formal greetings with whoever answered? These questions might seem small, yet they show how the telephone changed the texture of the evening. It created new interruptions, but also new possibilities for care. A family could receive news more quickly. A person could call for a doctor. A worker delayed by weather or transport could explain. A relative could hear a familiar voice without making a long journey. The party line held both sides at once. It was inconvenient, sometimes intrusive, and genuinely useful. It asked people to share a piece of modern life before modern life had learned how private it wanted to be. In the background of these calls sat another figure, the operator. If the party line made neighbors part of the telephone's social world, the exchange made operators part of its working world. For a long time, to make a telephone call was to ask another person to help you make it. At the exchange, operators sat before switchboards and connected callers by hand. Cords were placed into jacks. Signals were answered. A request was understood, repeated when necessary, and turned into a physical connection. The work demanded attention, speed, memory, patience, and a voice that could remain calm when callers were not. It could be repetitive, but it was not passive. An operator worked at the center of a web of human urgency. One caller might be arranging a delivery. Another might be trying to reach a doctor. Someone might be impatient. Someone might be lonely. Someone might be frightened. The operator could not solve every problem, but she made the conversation possible. Women became strongly associated with telephone operating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was shaped by the expectations and inequalities of the period, as well as by the expansion of clerical work available to women. The image of the polite female operator became a familiar part of public life. But the politeness expected of her should not hide the skill of the work. The exchange required judgment. Lines had to be managed. Calls had to be connected in the right order. Names, local geography, and the rhythms of the system had to be learned. As networks grew, so did the scale and discipline of the work. For the household caller, the operator could feel both near and distant. Her voice entered the home, but only briefly. She was neither family nor friend. She was the professional presence between the caller and the person desired. This shaped telephone manners. People learned formulas, the number or name requested, the moment of waiting, the announcement that a connection had been made. A call was not yet an entirely self-contained encounter. It began with a small act of cooperation. There is a quiet irony here. The telephone would later be celebrated for directness. Yet, its early social life depended on a hidden army of workers who directed, repaired, organized, and maintained the roots of speech. When we hear an old phrase, such as "operator, please," we are hearing the outline of that system. Behind the phrase is a workplace. Behind the workplace are shifts, training, supervision, wages, and the concentration required to keep a network usable. And outside the exchange, there were linemen, installers, engineers, clerks, directory printers, and many others. A household telephone may have looked like one object, but it rested on an entire chain of labor. The more dependable that chain became, the more people began to trust the telephone with ordinary life. It stopped being only a remarkable device. It became a way to arrange the day. That change was gradual. The telephone did not replace visits, letters, or face-to-face conversation. It added a new option between silence and travel. But options change expectations. Once a person knows that contact is possible, the absence of contact can begin to feel different. Consider the sentence, "I'll call you when I get home." It sounds completely ordinary now, but it contains a new promise. It says that a journey will not fully separate two people. It says that arrival can be announced. It says that a decision can be postponed until later in the evening, because later conversation is available. The telephone changed planning in this quiet way. Meetings could be revised, invitations could be accepted or declined without a visit. A shop could be asked whether it was open. A household could be warned that someone was delayed. A small uncertainty no longer had to last until the next encounter. This was especially important when travel, whether work or family care, made ordinary arrangements difficult. A call could shorten the anxious interval between not knowing and knowing a little more. It could not always solve a problem, but it could make coordination possible. At the same time, the telephone brought a new kind of waiting. A person might wait for a call. The evening could now include an appointment with a voice rather than with a visitor. Someone might sit nearer the instrument, listen for its bell, keep the line free, or feel disappointed when it remained silent. The telephone therefore altered both action and imagination. It created the possibility of contact, and then it made that possibility part of the emotional landscape. A silent telephone could mean peace. It could also mean that no news had come. The same device that reduced one kind of uncertainty could create another. There were practical adjustments too. Families negotiated access. Who was allowed to answer? Who took messages? Who decided whether a call was important? In a house with one telephone, the device belonged to everyone and no one. It was often placed in a common space where private talk became difficult. People learned to speak around others. They lowered their voices. They repeated the name of a caller. They asked someone else to leave the room for a moment. Or they accepted that much of their conversation would be heard by the household. The private voice and the shared home had to find a compromise. This is why the telephone is such a useful object for thinking about modern life. It was never just a communication tool. It changed the timing of care, work, friendship, family authority, and interruption. It inserted a distant voice into the household's choreography. And its effect was felt particularly clearly after dark, when the home had once been at its most separate from the wider world. An evening telephone call can be a small event. Perhaps it is a relative checking that someone arrived safely. Perhaps it is a parent asking a grown child to come home. Perhaps it is a friend with news, a workplace with a question, a doctor returning a message, or a neighbor passing on information. The content may be minor, yet the call changes the room for a few minutes. Someone answers. The conversation around them quiets or continues more softly. The caller is absent, but their words occupy space. Time is organized around the call. Before it, during it, after it. When the receiver is returned to its place, the household has been given something to discuss, worry about, remember, or act upon. This was one reason the telephone could feel intrusive. A letter waited on the table until you chose to read it. A telephone call asked you to respond in the present. Its politeness depended on timing, and its rudeness could be sudden. The bell did not know whether someone was resting, grieving, eating, or trying to put a child to sleep. But the telephone also made a new tenderness possible. A voice could cross a rainy distance. An elderly relative could be checked on without a journey. A person working late could say they were safe. A family separated by a few streets, or eventually by much greater distances, could share a moment that would previously have been carried only by letter. We should not romanticize this either. Access was unequal. Service could be costly. Rural areas and poorer households often received the benefits later or differently. The growth of telephone systems was shaped by business decisions, public policy, geography, and inequality. There was no single moment when the home became connected. Still, where the line arrived, the social meaning of being at home began to shift. Home was no longer only where you went when the day's contacts were finished. It could become a point from which the day continued in another form. A person could be called back into work. A family matter could travel in. A friendship could be maintained across a distance that once required planning. This is the beginning of a pattern that would grow with later technologies. The boundary between public time and private time did not disappear, but it became easier to cross. The early telephone did not predict every future device. It had a cord. It had a fixed place. It often required an operator. It could not follow a person down the street. Yet it introduced an idea that would become increasingly familiar: being available without being physically present. That idea changed the evening in ways people could feel before they had words for it. The ring might bring comfort. It might bring annoyance. It might bring neither, just another small task. But once it entered household life, silence was never quite the same. As telephone networks expanded, people wanted more direct control. The manual exchange was a remarkable system, but it had limits. It depended on workers making connections, on available lines, and on the capacity of the switchboard. Calls could take time. Errors could happen. Growth required more infrastructure and more labor. Automatic switching and dial telephones changed the experience of calling. Instead of speaking first to an operator, a caller could use a dial to send a sequence of signals through the network. The physical ritual was different. You lifted the receiver, listened for the tone or the quiet readiness of the line, and turned the dial one number at a time. The rotary dial gave the caller a new small responsibility. A number had to be known, remembered, written down, or found in the directory. It had to be turned carefully. A mistake meant beginning again. The call became more private, in one sense, because an operator was no longer needed for many local connections. But it also became more abstract. Instead of asking for a person by name, you entered a string of numbers. The directory became an ordinary domestic object. It sat near the telephone, often thick and practical, full of names, addresses, businesses, and instructions. It was a map of reachability. To look through it was to see a local world arranged by listing and number. The telephone itself changed shape over time. Wall sets, desk sets, separate receivers and transmitters, and later more familiar combined handsets, each shaped posture and space. Yet the essential scene remained recognizable. A household instrument, a ringing bell, a voice from elsewhere. Automated calling did not make the human network disappear. Operators continued to matter, especially for long-distance calls, assistance, emergencies, and many other services. Telephone workers remained essential. But for many callers, the experience became more immediate. The system retreated a little further behind the wall. This retreat made the telephone easier to take for granted. The less the caller had to see of the network, the more natural the connection could feel. A voice answered, and the improbable machinery beneath the conversation faded from attention. There is something peaceful in remembering the rotary dial now, not because it was faster, it was not, but because it made a call a sequence of deliberate motions. you could not rush through it entirely. There was a small pause in every number, a tiny return of the dial, a moment in which the caller still had time to reconsider. And then, on the far side of the network, another bell began to ring. It is tempting to tell the history of communication as a line of replacements. Letter replaced by telephone. Telephone replaced by something newer. One form of contact making the earlier form obsolete. Ordinary life is not so tidy. Letters remained. Visits remained. People still travelled to speak with one another. A telephone call could arrange a meeting, but it could not reproduce the experience of sitting together. It could carry urgency and affection, but it could not provide a meal, mend a fence, or offer a hand to hold. In fact, the telephone often made other forms of contact more possible. A call could organize a visit. It could make travel less uncertain. It could keep a relationship warm between letters or journeys. It became part of a wider fabric rather than a complete substitute for it. This is important for our story because the telephone's real power was not that it abolished distance. Distance remained in bodies, in travel time, in money, in social difference, in geography. The telephone altered the practical and emotional meaning of that distance. It made some moments crossable. An ordinary evening could now contain a voice from a place you could not see. The person might be a few streets away or many miles away. For a short time, the room made space for them. That was enough to change habits. It changed what counted as a reasonable delay. It changed what families expected from workers and from one another. It changed how a household managed news. It changed the relationship between silence and concern. And slowly, it changed the idea of privacy. Before the telephone, absence often meant absence. After the telephone, absence could mean that a person was not here, but might be called. The difference is subtle. It is not a revolution you can always see from the outside. A house may look much the same, curtains drawn, dishes washed, a light in the window. But inside, a wire has made the home porous. The outside world has been given a bell. The telephone became so familiar that it is easy to forget its strangeness. For generations, people learned the emotional grammar of the ring. A call might be welcome or inconvenient. It might be expected or unexpected. It might mean work, family, friendship, trouble, or nothing important at all. We learned, almost without noticing, to assign meaning before we even knew who was calling. The instrument taught its own manners. Do not call too late. Let it ring long enough. Leave a message. Keep the line clear. Do not monopolize the telephone. Write down the number. Speak clearly. Ask who is calling. Tell them you will call back. These rules were made collectively in millions of small encounters. They were never perfect. They changed with time. But they show that communication technology is always also a technology of etiquette. It asks people to decide how much access they owe one another. The early home telephone made this question visible. There was one device, often in a shared space, sometimes on a shared line, connected to a system that still had human operators at its center. It was difficult to imagine the call as purely individual. The entire household could feel its arrival. Later devices would make connection more personal and more constant, but the first domestic telephone already carried the seed of that future. It suggested that a person could be summoned from a distance. It made the voice portable before the person was portable. It made the household reachable before every individual carried a line of communication in a pocket. Tonight, though, we can leave the future waiting outside the door. We can return to the older room. The lamp is low. The work of the day is nearly done. Somewhere in the hallway, a telephone rests on its hook. It may ring, it may not. The family does not know. That uncertainty is the new sound of the evening. Perhaps this is why old telephones still feel so present in memory. They were solid objects. They had weight. The receiver was lifted and replaced. The cord had a shape. The dial made a circular journey. The bell had a particular sharpness, startling even when familiar. They belonged to rooms, and rooms remembered them. A hallway telephone could be a place where a teenager whispered, where a parent received news, where a grandparent waited, where a child learned the names of relatives they rarely saw. The machine became woven into domestic memory because it stood at the meeting point of private life and distant voices. It did not make the world smaller in every way, but it made the world capable of arriving more often. The history of the telephone is often told as a story of acceleration. A message that once took days takes minutes. A voice reaches farther. A network grows. The speed is real. But for an evening at home, the change can be understood more gently. The telephone added a possibility. It made it possible for a distant person to be heard before they could be seen. It made it possible to arrange, reassure, ask, answer, postpone, and return. It made it possible for care to travel quickly, and for interruption to travel with it. The old house did not vanish. The kettle still cooled. The clock still moved. People still sat quietly in rooms. Letters still arrived. Doors still opened and closed. But the household acquired a new listening. Somewhere beyond the walls, wires crossed streets and fields. In an exchange, or later inside an automatic system, a route could be made. A small bell could ring. Someone would rise from a chair, step into the hallway, and lift a receiver. Then two places, however briefly, would share the same moment. Perhaps that is enough to remember tonight. Not that the telephone conquered distance. Distance has always had its own weight. Only that, one evening at a time, the telephone taught the home a new way to be open. The instrument is quiet now. The room returns to itself. The line waits without urgency. And beyond the window, the night continues.